Alright, so I feel like I've been saying for a while now that if there's one genre or subgenre, whatever you want to call it, that needs some sort of comeback, it would be the slasher movie. Because it's very simple, but the formula has always kind of worked in its own way. And especially in like that sort of late 70s, early 80s era, we got a whole bunch of stuff like Halloween and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and stuff like that. Texas Chainsaw back in 74. And there was one in particular that kind of... There was a whole bunch just kind of one-offs that were just kind of in there. That were just kind of throwaway. But one that was in there that seems to have really slipped past was My Bloody Valentine from '81, the year right after the first Friday. And what's interesting about this is I think when you look at all those others that were mentioned, they had these really massive franchises, some of which are still happening. And if they're not happening now, they probably will be happening soon or in the near future, continuing. But this one never got a sequel despite its very open ending. And what's especially weird and kind of funny about that is the remake went the same route. Where it was like there were two big opportunities here to kind of expand on these, and this is the kind of killer, especially that you can imagine going. You can see like you can imagine the kind of fucked up shit they put into the lore or something like Michael got or Jason got or whatever, and that would have kind of been fun to see. Though, to the original's credit, it seemed like it was kind of out of its control in regards to the reception that it got at the time, which was really just bad luck. But to talk about these and how they work, but also how they might not work depending on how you look at it, because obviously, for both of them, the critical reception wasn't that great. I think the new one was a little more well received, but I think that's also the idea of people being a bit more hip to the retro idea of the slasher might have had some appeal that the old one might not have at the time. Not just because of what was going on at the time that kind of got it censored, which we'll talk about. But obviously it was in this whole realm where we had just had Friday and we had just had Halloween a few years before that. And what's interesting about this one in particular, the original, is the life it has managed to carry on since, because I can certainly see where this would come out in 1981, and people would say, oh, we've seen this movie. Like, yeah, we have a different setting, we have a different killer, but we've basically seen this movie. But that's kind of what the slasher genre is. Yeah, it's gonna be the same movie, you just change the location and the killer, but once again, that's kind of the appeal, and the appeal of it is not just the killer and how they do things, but how that sort of carries on throughout it. But the thing here is that when you look at the director, George Mahalka, he had this idea that sounds very weird if you just say it, but when you see the movie, especially the opening scenes, you completely get what he's talking about, where he mentioned this seemingly outlandish idea of wanting to do the Deer Hunter of slasher movies. And what's interesting about this is, by the way, obviously, I think a lot of people that have probably owned the original movie at one time or another probably owned this DVD that comes with April Fool's Day also, but obviously we're strictly talking about one of these things, and the other isn't really even that much worth talking about anyway, but we might get to that point down the road if we run out of ideas. But yeah, when you look at this opening scene and you see these characters, because usually when you look at stuff like, Halloween and Friday and Texas and stuff like that, the whole idea is, it was what Roger Ebert called the dead teenager movie, where it was teenagers are introduced at the beginning and then they're dead by the end, usually in really graphic and gruesome ways. And that's what the formula was. That's basically what the slasher formula was. So it still kind of feels a bit unique whenever you see a slasher movie that's main characters are adults that like are going to jobs and doing all this stuff and not just doing the whole thing. But what's interesting about the characters in My Bloody Valentine is it's like they're kind of trying to capture what a teenage cast would have, where basically their whole thing is they basically just want to have this party that triggers the killer, which is going into kind of this sort of ridiculous territory that the killer is triggered by a Valentine's Day party, and his actual threat is, you either cancel your party or I'm going to start killing people. It's kind of hilarious when you see it play out. But when the kills actually start happening, there's definitely a movie here, but there's obviously also a balancing act, and you can look at it for both of these movies, which is the balancing act of basically embracing the silliness that can come with the slasher genre, and basically what I really loved that you can really see in the remake is movies like this and slasher movies. I think another reason slasher movies have such an appeal is they're really not trying to do anything else other than please the audience. Because you do have movies where it's like they'll throw in a message or something like that, or they'll want you to care about a certain thing or make some sort of kind of point. And oftentimes it'll be like this piece of art that the filmmaker's trying to kind of make for himself. Like it's something cathartic for his or herself, the filmmaker. But you're not going to really find that in a slasher movie. Like, it's really just, we want the audience to be as entertained and love this experience as much as possible. And when you look at how this one was forced to be cut down and was forced to have a lot of the gore taken out of it, it was basically like the remake came along and said, let's immediately give them that. Let's immediately give them what they really wanted that was taken away from them in the last movie. And that's, like I said, when you're starting off at that point, that's kind of where your head needs to be at when you take this in. But the idea of making something, while holding on to that, still trying to make something kind of character-driven. Because I've actually defended the Friday the 13th movies before, because it's interesting how when you just think of them as, they're movies that just introduce characters just to kill them and then it's over. There's a lot more time than I think people remember devoted to introducing the characters in a lot of the Friday the 13th movies. Like, the entire first half of the movie is the characters just dicking around and us kind of getting to know them a little bit before they're eventually killed. And this case, like I said, in particular is interesting because not only do we have adults and we see them at work, like, it's like the opening scenes of The Deer Hunter, it really is. So he did manage to capture that. But we're also especially here setting a tone where we were talking about how all they really want to do is actually party at the end of the day, despite the fact that that's what this killer doesn't want. But you have this sort of sleepy, atmospheric town, and you see where like everything kind of looks dull, and you can see that this is sort of like the idea of a Valentine's Day party appealing to these people seems totally outlandish, but when you're looking at the town that they live in, it's sort of like any chance to have a party like this is going to be something that drives them and something that they really want to do, regardless of the bloodbath that might be happening around them and threatening them should they partake in this. But then, on top of that, you have the contrast of, like, there's a whole thing devoted to Mabel decorating the town. And the fact that you have, you know, this whole sort of bright and... I said, it looks like the way you would decorate a classroom in February. But this approach is taken all over the town, and the way that sort of contrasts, not just with the town underneath these decorations, but the events that are going to start happening. And that unforgettable image that we see multiple times of the actual human hearts inside of the heart-shaped candy boxes, the chocolate boxes. And the way it captures that, I think, kind of is where you'll find the unique quality when you look at other slashers and then you look at this. But the thing about that also is, like, the director wanting to have that sort of humanity, because what's interesting about this also, and they seem to really double down on this in the remake also, is the idea of introducing a love story into this. And it's like, yeah, in slasher movies you're going to have your characters that are, like, you know, young and in love or whatever. But in these we're actually getting, like, love triangles. Or even more people involved than that when you look at the remake, where there's 4 people involved. But you think, well, that seems out of place, and it's like, why are we so worried about this? Like, there's a whole soap opera plot going on in the remake, where it's not just that their marriage is troubled by the fact that Tom has come back into town and he was, you know, the old, you know, boyfriend or the old crush or whatever, and then Axel is also having the affair with Megan and stuff like that, and it's like this whole thing that you would see in a soap opera or something, but then it's like, just when you think, well, that seems out of place and pointless, why do they devote so much time to that? Um, yeah, it's a slasher movie, but it's also a Valentine's Day movie, technically. So it actually seems weirdly appropriate that there's like a whole sort of love story and like love turmoil going on while this slasher movie is going on around it. It's like, if you're going to utilize the holiday you have, this would be the way to do it. So you're pretty much getting everything that the title promises you and the premise promises in this really fun and campy way still, though. So yeah, as far as it being a slasher movie, despite having those bits of humanity, it does feel like we're dealing with real people with real jobs that have real relationships with each other in a real town, more or less. But then also it'll open up with, we get tits in the opening scene, and everybody's goofing off. There's the guy that, does the death prank, and all that. Stuff that you would see in a Friday movie from, teenage characters. But it's still the fact that these characters aren't quite growing out of that phase makes them perfect. The perfect cast for a movie like this as that goes on. And you even get the warnings that come, like, we have a Crazy Ralph character, in this case it's the bartender, saying, like, the town is cursed and stuff like that, and warning that, everybody in town is stupid. Basically. He has so much contempt for everybody and knows that they're going to get themselves killed. And that whole thing just kind of sets up the whole vibe that had just been set up, like, the year before, especially with Friday. Like, we talk about how back the slasher genre goes, but as far as, like, really setting up the tropes, it seems to really... Friday the 13th really set a lot of those off, it feels like, or at least the ones that we recognize now in the form that they're in right now. But talking about adding humanity, something that may be a bit more missing in the remake, but the way they tackle it here, where we have... There are people that are beyond these characters that are killed in the remake, specifically older characters. But what's interesting that both these movies do, but especially talking about this one, the original establishing it in '81, is the idea of killing off older characters, like literally old people. Because usually, like Michael Myers, bumped off a couple of old people in the second Halloween, I think it was, and probably further down the road. But usually those were just like, it was almost like the movies almost took it easy on older people, where it's like they just get, like one stab or something. Like it wouldn't be too over the top or too graphic. And one of the first deaths in this movie is Mabel, who's probably the nicest person in this whole... The sweet old lady that's in every neighborhood, has one of the most gruesome outcomes right away, with that dryer reveal, which is still gross even now. Even you could say it's grosser in the remake, but the fact that it's Mabel it makes it especially jarring and makes it feel even more brutal than it already is, I think. But that's the thing, is not only is it that the brutality is usually saved for the younger characters, but the fact that there's like a surprising emotional moment when you go in this, where you can see the humanity the director was going for, when it's after we've had, Mabel's death, and that's the whole thing, where usually in slasher movies the thing is you don't get too much of the emotional reaction. Where it's like these characters are in a slasher movie, so it's like, oh, their friends are dying, and they'll acknowledge that their friends are dying, but you don't see much grieving in a slasher movie. Typically because there's not enough time, but it also tends to be kind of just skipped over anyway, because you're gonna... then you'd have a whole tonal balance you'd have to try to do. And My Bloody Valentine is the one that has the balls to do that, to try that balance. So we do get this moment, where there's a couple of decent fake-outs here, but one is when the chief gets the box of chocolates, and of course we already had the heart reveal by this point, and when he opens it, we're bracing ourselves for another heart, a human heart, and it's the chocolates with the note from Mabel, and suddenly you have, like, it's like hits sort of emotionally, like in a way you're not expecting at all. When you were bracing yourself for a scare, it's like you were bracing yourself for something, but what hit in a significantly different way than you were anticipating, which is great. And then especially like when the whole thing about you having like your guard up for anything, and it's like emotion is not what you're expecting, that you're trying to protect yourself from. So the inclusion of stuff like that felt really unique also. like especially following a death that was so gruesome. To have this emotional beat after it, because usually the gruesomeness can be like almost even more of a distance to the audience. The more over the top it gets, to where it becomes almost like a ride rather than seeing the characters as real people. And that's the thing, is either of those are win-win for an audience that's coming to a slasher movie, because if you hit them with the emotion, they're going to feel that, not anticipating that they're going to, but they're also here for the thrill of like the gore and the kill and all that stuff, and they're gonna get that as well. So it's gonna be pleasing like universally practically, depending on what the audience is here for. But another case that they set up in an interesting way is talking about like the decent fake outs. How they do have like, we have Sarah, who's going to be kind of a major character here because she's the center of this love triangle, as she is in the remake. But what they've established already by killing Mabel and everything they've set up, and just like the darkness and tone, when we see Sarah getting stalked, like there are cases where it's like when you see that, it's a fake out, and it's not going to be somebody because that character is a major character. But still, after everything's been set up, when we do get that fake out shot where it's like somebody's lingering behind her, you kind of get the sense almost right away, like, oh, well, she could die right now. And I guess it wouldn't the whole love triangle wouldn't matter, because I could totally see a slasher movie doing that, just setting up something and then just killing it off immediately. But no, it is a fake out, and an effective one because of that, which is really fun. So, and talking about just fun in general, it does eventually kind of have that playful factor to it, where we have stuff like when who is it? Dave is killed and like put in the refrigerator, and he goes in there and gets a beer, and the body's just in there, and he doesn't see it. You can get the sense that while the director did want to do like that, going into humanity and having characters you actually cared about, there was also that sense of it's still a slasher movie, and that's another thing that you're here for. And there's the whole thing of like the bartender's death, which would be a good reveal and would be a good kill, but I do think they lingered on it a bit too much when he was setting up the prank, for the suit to come out of that door. But he kept playing with the door like 4 or 5 times, so you could, after a while, you got the sense that there was what the fake out was going to be. And maybe that's also just a case of it. Like, it's not necessarily that it was going for a surprise factor, but it's like giving the audience what they hope is going to happen. Like, I feel like there's a big difference there that gets overlooked in pretty much any movie. The idea of something being predictable for worse versus something being predictable, but it's what the audience was hoping for, and they do get that payoff that they wanted. And how that's totally different from the feeling of, oh, I saw that coming, so I feel nothing towards that. Because sometimes predictability can be like infuriating if it's too obvious. But, like I said, it's hard to go into that with the slasher movie, because slasher movies are always just giving you exactly what you go into, is assuming they're done right. Some of them try to overcomplicate themselves, and it ends up not working out, but when they're as simple as this, as most of them are, it's a lot of fun. But, yeah, talking about the whole censoring thing and getting, like, obviously there's the whole thing where the MPAA is going to be, like, a stickler regardless, but it does seem like it's more, we kind of shifted eventually into show as much gore as you want to. It's like the sex and the nudity that's like, oh no, don't do that. But obviously at the time here, it was like, especially movies in this era, especially when you look at like Evil Dead and stuff like that, which was like around the same time, so many movies were just getting slapped with NC-17 and X and stuff like that, based on gore. Gore that's more or less pretty commonplace now. But the idea that this movie was chopped down by, like, is it like 9 minutes, I think? To the point that it kind of felt like the movie was, like, there's something about cutting movies down a little bit, and then there's the idea of, like, just completely neutering them, which is apparently what happened with this. I do think there is a lot going on here as far as, like, how the kills are shown. Because I remember the director was talking about something where it was like, even when he was cutting out all the gore scenes, the censors were still coming after him because of the sound. And it's like, that just shows you, if anything, how well made it was. Like, if the sound was that effective by itself, that's it's a shame that it got as cut down as it did. Even though it's still effective in its form, it does kind of give you that whole yearning for whatever's missing. But that's the thing it feels like that was a lot of the job of the remake, was to sort of fill in that gap that felt like it was left by that. Um, because obviously when we're talking about the climax, there is still going to be, some suspense here in regards to the fact. First off, the whole thing of being filmed in like actual mines really sets a different kind of tone than it probably would on a set, and there is this real. Like I would imagine that would have to help the actors also in regards to finding some place of real terror. But just that whole idea where it's like it feels weird, it feels uncomfortably authentic, to know that they're in like real mines and doing all this, um, and that's going to make it significantly scarier. But there was also the whole thing about John Lennon and people talking about the authenticity of the horror, and the fact that real life violence bleeding into the movies was starting to make people really uncomfortable at this time. And a lot of that also apparently took part in this getting cut down, and probably had a lot to do with the fact that they never expanded on it with other movies, if I had to guess. Um, Despite the fact that this was seen as like a temporary time, where it's like it seems like there's so many, not to undermine any real life tragedies by any means, but it does seem like it's this weird case of so many movies throughout history have had just really bad luck when it comes to real events affecting the way people see them, like how so many movies got pushed after 9/11, and the whole sniper thing that was going on around 2002 when Phone Booth came out and Phone Booth had to be pushed, and the whole, when O got delayed because of Columbine. It was like there's always these really weirdly coincidental things that line up and make movies more uncomfortable to audiences, or what people think will make audiences uncomfortable when you're looking at real life versus the movies, and how much of a part that played in this, where there was that temporary time where movie violence was just basically shut down because of John Lennon's murder. Which it makes sense to an extent, but a lot of the time it's also people like really sort of having knee-jerk reactions to movies and their violence. Especially in the 80s, when obviously violence was going to be like super campy. But once again, if you put yourself in that mindset of a 1981 audience, their violence was probably much more terrifying then. But that's the thing, is it's still enjoyable now because it's that sort of almost like a retro nostalgia kind of thing when you see the gore the way it was in the 80s, and how it doesn't necessarily look real, but it can still get that feeling, that really sort of cringe inducing feeling of seeing a really well executed gore scene. um, and then, yeah, obviously we get to the very end and we get to the reveal, and I love the fact, like, it I don't know if more movies should strive for this or what, but it's also something that's kind of hilarious to me. I love the idea of Axel's motive being shown in like 5 seconds, where he looks up and he just says why, and we literally get like 2 quick clips of like, it's basically, we see basically an equation of, it's like this little kid plus this dude getting killed equals Axel, and that's that's all it is. And then he runs off into the abyss, and it just ends. And it's, which is honestly kind of a crazy ending, that there's no sort of catharsis whatsoever. There's no even like fake out like there is in the remake. He just leaves, and it's over. Like I said, the fact that it sets up multiple sequels, and you can see this being a multiple sequel thing in another, like if we were in another timeline or something, and all the different directions that would have gone. But it's like, I kind of love it. Doesn't, obviously we know who the killer is, but it still kind of gives me vibes of Black Christmas's ending, because the fact that it's so amazing because of where it ends, and because of the fact that we don't know anything when it ends. I feel like it's kind of amazing. Like, if you want to, find some silver lining in it not getting any other movies, I would think that it's infinitely crazier that Axel's just left like that, just left open like that, and everybody knows it. he's calling out to them as he's running off into the dark, and then it just ends. And this movie does have something that also kind of puts it just a little bit a higher notch of, like, this isn't my favorite slasher movie by far. Like, I'm still more about, you know, the classics that are really well known. I guess I'm a basic bitch like that, but that's the way it is. But there is something that this has that so many other movies should have had, especially in this era. And I was just talking with a friend relatively recently about how this is absolutely something that needs to come back. The fact that the killer has a theme song is amazing. And it's like, I want so many other horror movie villains to have a theme song. Like, sure, they have themes as far as, like, within the score, but I mean, like, an actual ballad. The ballad that Harry Warden gets, that's something that should have been a thing. That should have been a trend. And I would love to live in an alternate world where that happened for, like, most slasher villains. But obviously, once again, though, that makes this sort of stand above and makes it, you know, much more unique to the movie itself, which is great. But to talk more about the remake, now that we've gone through all that, which is brought to us by Patrick Lussier, who definitely is a visionary in his way. We talked about Drive Angry a couple of years ago. And he definitely knows how to make a wild movie. But talking about going into this and talking about how we never got sequels to this movie, and the gore was really, really cut down to almost being non-existent. The fact that this one is trying to atone for that, not just in, you know, giving us all the gore, which it certainly does, but the fact that the climax of the original movie, like all the big payoffs in the original movie, the moment they were like everything went big and it's like this is where the audience was having their big moments, is essentially the opening of this movie. Like the opening of this movie is essentially the climax of the original movie. And then we get like a 10-year time jump. And it's like, to establish it like that, where, like I said, there's a real love radiating from this movie for the audience and for what fans of this were hoping for. And I feel like they found that sort of immediately, like when, like, the first kill is the axe coming through the back of the head and then through the eye. And that's not even to take into account the 3D effect. It was right at that moment where I can just imagine, like, I saw this in the theater, but it was like during the day, so there wasn't that many people in there. But I can imagine this being in like a crowded theater of people that were waiting for it, and that moment when the eye comes through, being a moment where like a whole crowd in one room comes to the realization all at once, this is going to be exactly what we wanted. This is exactly what we've been craving ever since we saw this. And how it's almost like this sort of perfect continuation of the feelings that the other one left us off with. And it's like this one's sort of like, well, obviously the first one has payoffs in itself on their own. It's almost like this one is like the payoff itself to the entirety of the original movie. That's the way I see it anyway. And it's also starting it with, I was talking about how there's like a nostalgic feeling of like the way the gore is presented, what we see in the original movie. I love the fact that Tom Atkins is in this, particularly. We've got a few people in here, but Tom Atkins especially is one of those actors that just gives me nostalgic vibes of like 80s era horror. So to have him playing a major character here, just like every time I see him, I just get, you know, nostalgic for like Night of the Creeps or something like that, or when he bookends Creepshow, all that stuff. I guess you could throw Halloween 3 in it depending on how what you are and aren't a fan of. Yeah, and so many other legendary movies, but here, when we're talking about the new characters, some of them are new characters, some of them are not, and some of them have the same names and the same motivations, but they're totally different people than what we were looking at here. Where we do have, you know, Tom and Sarah and Axel, and of course, eventually we will learn that the killer has been switched up on us as well, which was a really interesting and cool choice. But yeah, the same thing where we're talking about where the town has this sort of, you know, atmospheric vibe about it. In this one, yeah, it is a lot more sort of dark and broody, like it would have been in the 2000s compared to the 80s. And the whole idea of the 80s having that sort of contrast where the background was covered in all these decorations. And obviously we're not dealing with that here. I would have liked to have seen the contrast of this portrayal of the town trying to be decorative and festive. Would have definitely really laid on that contrast, but there is still that sense of fun throughout this movie. Like, that's the thing, is when you think maybe it won't be as, like, bright looking and festive looking as this one is, and you would think, like, it trying to look really dark, and just sort of sinister without really trying, would kind of take away the effect, and kind of suck the fun out of it. But no, there's really no sense here at all that they were going for some sort of even darker tone than before. They're definitely having fun with this, and even when we get to stuff like I was saying, like the dryer, where they're playing with the gore even more and really kind of amping it up for us. And obviously with the 3D effect, we have stuff like Tom Hanks' death, for instance, where actual body parts will be flying towards the camera, as well as random mundane things. And yeah, it is worth noting. You could say that this one has the gimmick to sort of fall back on, where it might have more focus on that, whereas this one tried to focus more on the characters and stuff like that. But it is interesting to go back and look at this, because when you think of it as just, oh, it's a remake of a slasher movie, they've made plenty of those, and move on. But as far as kind of setting something up, if you remember, this did come out like at the very beginning of 2009, which was the year of Avatar. So 2009 was basically ripe in this area with movies that were like, we were building the Avatar hype, as 3D was starting to become more prominent, basically leading up to Avatar's release that December. And Journey to the Center of the Earth had come out the year before, but I don't think anybody really cared. So this one, like, really specifically built up that it was going to be, like, 3D was going to be this really great thing. Obviously, Rodriguez toyed with it a little bit with Spy Kids in, like, 2003, I think. But talking about when it, like, really, really came back for a long period of time, and it's still... I didn't even know this until I was looking at times for No Time to Die, but apparently the 3D conversion thing is still a thing. But the whole idea of actually, like, shooting it for 3D was a whole other thing. And while obviously if you're watching it in, like, 2D, it's gonna look ridiculous and sort of falter because of that. But to bring back that sort of retro feel, where we've had 3D horror movies like, you know, the Third Friday movie, but the idea of the way they were doing the 3D in this new way with this new technology, it was really interesting how the 3D had this way of being retro and new at the same time, where it was like, it made you nostalgic for that when 3D was a craze back, you know, when it was, like, first a thing, versus as it was taking off again, as, like, you know, when we were in the Avatar era and new technology was happening. So the way it was kind of able to grasp both things there makes it pretty unique for a time, even if it does seem like a gimmick, you know, in retrospect. It was kind of a big deal in kind of a low-key way at the time, especially since it came so early before it really started to take off. And, like, even that era between this and Avatar, there was a lot of it. Like, Coraline was in there, like, right after this. And they were really, really building it up. But this was kind of, like, at the start of that, like, the very start of that sort of resurgence that we saw. But I said, I've bashed 3D before, because a lot of it is relatively useless. But when you're using it to this degree, and like I said, kind of combining two different things, it can find a way to work out. This one even comes with, like, this was before we got into the plastic, more sustainable glasses, when, like, the Avatar era started coming around. That's how old this is. These glasses are promoting Saw 6. Which had come out of October of that year. So, yeah, that's where Lionsgate was back then, remember that? But, going on that also, I do want to talk about the approach in general, because while a lot of remakes are looked at pretty cynically, and it's like, it's a slasher movie, what are you going to really add to it? Because if there's one thing that's kind of missing here, it is that sort of focus on the characters thing, and that sort of sense of community from these people. Like, it's there a little bit, we mostly just see it through the cops, and not the actual people like we do in the original. But the thing that is very interesting about this in regards to how it wanted to approach, and how I was talking about how it's, like, kind of, it was made specifically for the audience. Todd Farmer is the one of the writers on it, and Todd Farmer's one of those guys that his name is attached to stuff that doesn't have the best reception, and it's usually horror related. There was he had a script, I think it was his script for Halloween 3, which would have been the Halloween 3 of Zombies movies, Rob Zombie's Halloween movies. And I read that script, and it wasn't that great, but it was definitely a Todd Farmer script. And what's interesting is it'd be easy to dismiss him because his movies haven't quite landed when he's trying to use these, old characters. Because he wrote Jason X as well, and we saw how that turned out for a lot. Some people like Jason X, but it's got a varied reputation, I guess we can say, if we're going to put it nicely. But I do need to recommend something while we're talking about Todd Farmer, and that is there was a web series that sadly is no more, tragically is no more, called Adam Green's Scary Sleepover. And Adam Green is the guy that did the Hatchet series, and he did Frozen and stuff like that, the ski lift movie. And what's great about that series is Adam Green has people over to his little... Sometimes it's his actual house, sometimes it was like kind of a studio setting that looked like a bedroom. But he would have people that he worked with or people that were in the horror genre, like horror legends, over, and they would basically hang out like they were at a sleepover. And they would like eat junk food and like, build Legos or whatever. And they would talk about horror and its whole thing and where their ideas would come from and stuff like that. And then they would watch a movie associated with that person, and then they would lay down and talk about their fears. Like it's an amazing show that's just hanging out on YouTube. And Todd Farmer has an episode on there, and he talks, while they're building Legos, he's talking about his process and his ideas going into Jason X and what it was supposed to be. And you really get the sense that this is a guy that has a lot of creativity in him and a lot of really great ideas that kind of get lost in the studio system. So it probably gives him a worse reputation as a writer than he deserves. But he's got a lot of interesting ideas. And the way he approaches his ideas and his writing in general, you can really tell in this conversation. And it makes you see... really, this show in general will make you see these people differently. He has an episode with Tony Todd that, like, you will never see Tony Todd in the same way. And I mean that in the best possible way. So I really highly recommend that to kind of get off on a tangent. But coming back to that, yeah, like I was saying, as far as character work, what we do have is our sort of love thing going on here, where we have 4 people involved. And there's some turmoil here, and like I said, it feels like a soap opera, but at the same time, it's a Valentine's Day movie, so if anything, it's kind of hilarious that so much, like, almost seems intentionally hilarious that so much time is devoted to this story about these particular characters. But then as it goes on, yeah, obviously our kills are going to be a lot more intense, a lot more on-screen, and the whole presence of who may or may not be Harry Warden has this very, heavy, intimidating presence. He had that in the first one too, but one thing you can put with both these movies, there is a very intense kill. Sylvia's death in the original movie is very intense, and I think a lot of that has to do with how both these movies really utilize how scary breathing is, which sounds like a weird thing to say, but when you think about it, there's so many horror movies where somebody's breathing into a phone. That's never not scary because it feels real. There's the whole idea of when we get point of view shots of Michael Myers and we hear the sound of the breathing from inside the mask, and it's like there was one night where I watched Halloween, and then my window was open, and I could swear I heard that breathing sound through the mask outside the window, and it didn't seem like there was anything out there when I actually looked, but that was a terrifying few seconds. And yes, the idea of breathing through a gas mask also is going to be incredibly terrifying, always. Original or remake, that's the kind of thing where that's another thing where just the design of the killer himself is kind of ingenious and certainly terrifying, where he even looks particularly monstrous. Like, where there's actually a monster in House of a Thousand Corpses that looks very similar. It's like that was an actual monster. It's like this is a person, but still has a very monstrous look to him. And that's it is these things where you kind of, lament a little bit for the fact that we didn't get more movies of this and how it would have gone. And I'm not usually one of those people that's like, oh, this needed a sequel and stuff, because so many sequels have, like, ruined themselves that it's never something I crave because it goes bad more often than it doesn't. like I said, when you look at stuff like the Halloween franchise and the Nightmare franchise and the Friday franchise, it's like there's stupid shit in those. They go in stupid fucking directions and they make really bad, stupid choices. But we still love those franchises and we love all the different ways they tried to open up new ideas for those. And that's what I was talking about with Todd Farmer also, where it's like sometimes having ideas is they can fall short if you don't quite completely get there. But just having the ideas is something that seems like it's missing a lot. So you can really appreciate that when they do come along. So yeah, and then once again we do have more suspense. I think this one may up the suspense factor over the originals, because obviously it's hard to say anything about the original with how cut down it is. It's hard to judge it fairly. But when you get scenes in this, like when he's the Shining scene, for instance, when he's breaking through the door and Sarah and Megan are trying to get through the window, even if it will give you Shining vibes at first, it's still a very well done and really suspenseful and intense scene. And you really actually do feel the fear for these characters, if only because these are the characters we've actually gotten to know a little bit compared to some of the others. But it is here, and I also love how intense it is, where, like, how long they wait. Like, how much they really build up to the very last minute, the identity of the killer. Because, yeah, obviously we go into this one knowing that Axel was the killer in the first one, and so the way they... Like, even if Axel wasn't the killer in the first movie, the way they build up that it could have been Axel is really well done and very convincing. And the fact that there's just one more twist on that, to where, like, even if you're watching it, blind to the original movie, it's like this, big reveal that that's been the person that seems like the protagonist this whole time. But that extra twist of people that did go in, assuming it would be Axel again, had to have been fucking wild. I'm pretty sure I saw this one before I saw the original, so either way, there's like always going to be a surprise factor. And I could see it maybe seeming like a bit of a cop-out, of seeing, like the whole idea of seeing Tom and Harry Warden, in quotes, together in a shot, could seem a lot like cheating, but like, if somebody said that, I probably wouldn't argue with them, but I do think it's more well done than it would sound on paper. The whole idea of this being some sort of manifestation of his mind. And we get, like, those cool shots when he's taking the lights out, and we get, as the lights go out, there's flashes of him in the actual suit. It might be a bit on the nose, but it's really fucking cool. I don't care. So, yeah, and then, of course, once again, another cliffhanger ending that was never quite paid off. I'm still not, like I said, as far, I don't know how I would have felt about it if this one got a sequel when this one didn't, because I feel like we get stuff like the one thing that comes to mind that was kind of in this era was when the remake of The Hills Have Eyes got a sequel, and it was like one of the worst things ever. Like, just fuck that movie all around. And it's like, I don't think that would have worked out in the same way it would have if we had gotten, like, there's just something about, I guess, the 70s and 80s where the way they approached franchises, where they were willing to embrace all those things. And you can see, like maybe if, there was a newer series, it'd be something that we could take a little more seriously or something. Like, there's just something about the 70s and 80s era where when they went in the stupid direction, it was much easier to swallow. But it's almost like now you feel like the filmmakers should know better. So it's like whenever they do go in a stupid direction, it just doesn't have the same effect. So I don't think it would have been the payoff that it was when we say this just kind of gave us, while it's a remake, it still almost felt like it gave us a continuation of the feeling that we had for these, and was giving us what this one might have been missing. But I'm glad that the answer to that wasn't, hey, here's this franchise people wanted from this movie. It wouldn't have been the same thing at all. And I know that's just speculation, but I feel very confident in saying that. So yeah, so as far as, like, having a preference, I do, like I said, even though we're all here for the camp and the gore and how that's all fun, I do like that the director, Malka, had the balls to try to do the balance of, making the characters like real and give them some sort of humanity, and also give us the really fun slasher and try to find that balance without it being too tonally weird. I do think it has the edge based on that alone. But like I said, I do love the approach that the remake took. I didn't even mention. I think Betsy is her name. Let me double check that real quick. Of course, her name is not here. But the one that has the very prolonged nude scene, which is another one of those things that just really, really shows the commitment. To my understanding, I guess some people gave Todd Farmer shit because it's the scene that he has the cameo in, and people are like, oh, you wrote that scene for yourself. But it is to my understanding that it was her idea to do the extended nude scene. Like the scene where she grabs the sheet when she's like, going for the gun was supposed to be her covering herself, and it was her idea to say, that's too many things going on with my hands, so we're going to forget the sheet. Yeah, so that sort of commitment can be something where it's like, even if we don't necessarily have something here where we really get to know a character before their death scene, you do also have character moments here where it's like, that scene where she's able to act in a very authentic way while doing like one of the longest nude scenes ever for a movie like this. That's a different kind of commitment that could be just as effective. But as far as like the community that this one sets up, I think is what kind of gives it the edge also. And then when they start getting off, there is stuff that's a bit more like when Hollis dies and there's an actual emotional reaction to it. There is something. There are moments in here also that feel authentic, like when they're she's driving off with Tom and Axel's calling her and like begging her to get out of the car. Like, you can say this has like wooden performances and characters in it, but that particular moment from Kerr Smith when he's begging her to get out of the car feels like you can really feel the intensity in that, and the way the suspense builds on that and how real it feels, the fear itself. There is something. See, overall, I feel like they kind of balance out and give you. They work together to give you one complete experience. But if like I had to choose one, like most people, I think it would fall on the original. But I think even the people that made this, of course, would probably tell you that. So, but there's definitely an experience here to be had. Both they go together quite nicely, despite one being a remake, which is something you don't really get to see very often or say very often. So that's what makes these kind of unique in themselves. So yeah. So the perfect thing for this time of year, or February, I guess, depending on the kind of person you are and how you're feeling around that time. But yeah, so I guess I'm going to leave this at that. We're going to do one more versus after this, one or two more, and then I'm going to revisit a series, and then we've got No Time to Die and all that stuff coming out, and then we'll go from there. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.